Alrighty, folks, welcome to another edition of the Stone and Tile Show. If you're listening, hi. If you're watching me on Facebook, hi, how are you? I had a bunch of interesting stuff to talk about tonight. We're primarily going to be talking about how to polish difficult stones. So, we're going to go over some basic theory here in a few minutes, and you have to wait to the very end of this broadcast, and I'll give you some of my tips to help you polish some of those more difficult materials. But before I get started, I had something happen to me a couple of weeks ago that I think is funny. It's just, and I hesitated talking about this on previous shows, but I figured, hey, what the hell? This is podcast radio. This is not over the airways, and it's not going to be bad, but it's really really funny. And I don't know how many of you use what they call talk or text to text or text to talk, whatever it's called. In other words, you're driving down a road, someone is texting you. So obviously you don't want to be texting on your phone, but you can actually talk. And you talk into that and it turns it into a text, right? Well, I had something just I didn't realize I sent it and it was ridiculous. I mean, not ridiculous, but it was really super, super funny. So I have to tell you what it is. Anyway, let me kind of set this up. I was talking to someone via text, and I was driving down the road so I could actually read the text, but I didn't want to type, right? So we're talking about, I believe it was epoxy cleanup. They had a film of epoxy that they needed to be cleaned up, and he didn't have anything on him at the time. So, I suggested maybe using some Ajax or some Comet. So he basically sent me a text back, and I'll read you what the exact words of the text were. It was, "Will barkeeper's friend be the same as Ajax and Comet?" So I happen to know what barkeeper's friends is, so I replied that barkeeper's friend. This is what I said. This is not what came out, but this is what I said. I said barkeeper's friend is simply oxalic acid and blah 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 blah. And I talked about abrasives or whatever, and I pressed the send button. And all of a sudden, I get this laughing out loud text back, and I'm like, "Well, what did I say? What's so funny about that? That barkeeper's friend has oxalic acid." Well, this is what actually it auto corrected to be. Are you ready for this? It came out to be barkeeper's friend is simply exotic ass, and I don't think there's any other abrasives in it. So I, I read that and I actually saved it. And I just thought it was funny, and it'd be interesting to hear from you guys too if you have any interesting or faux pas when it comes to texting. All right, before we get to how to polish difficult stones, let me give out the phone number here. It's 323-870-3968. That's 323-870-3968. If you're listening to me live, go ahead and call in if you have any questions or whatever. So I've got some stuff to talk about here, and I constantly get questions from you guys when you're on a job and you're polishing a certain type of marble. And this is the type of question I get. Fred, I just polished this, say next door, or I just polished this a few weeks ago in another location. It's the same exact material, but it's not doing the same thing it did before. Why is that? Well, we're going to discuss why that is here in a minute. But before we get to that, I want to back up a little bit and talk to you about why stone shines to begin with. Now, if you've attended a lot of my seminars, we go over this in quite a bit of detail and kind of give you the 25-cent version, if you will. But if you imagine, I guess the best analogy for this is to take a lake. Yeah, that's right, a pond, a lake, or whatever. And let's say you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and you're out there on the lake just as the sun's coming up, and the lake is just really wavy. I mean, it's a really bad day. It's a windy day. If you look over the edge of the boat, do you see your reflection in the water? No, you don't, right? Now, the same thing applies to a honed or a rough piece of marble, granite, or whatever stone you're talking about, where it's very, very rough. Microscopically, you can't see the waves in there, but it's very, very rough. So basically, what happens is when the light hits those waves, it bounces in all different directions. And I actually came up with a little diagram right here that shows the light coming in on this really, really rough surface here, and the light rays just bounce in all directions. And to your eye, that looks rough. There's no shine to it. So how we achieve the polish on stone, and there's different ways of getting there, which we're going to discuss in a minute, is to smooth it out. We want to make that surface as flat as can be. So now you go back the next day and you're fishing in your boat and it's a nice flat day. I mean, the lake is like glass. What can you see now? You can look overboard. You can see your face. You can probably put your hand up and count your fingers. You can see the trees. You can see the birds flying over the head. And if you're lucky, maybe you can see the fish you're trying to catch. But anyway, what happens there is this in this particular diagram here the sun hits the smooth surface and bounces back parallel to the way it's coming in. And to your eye, you can see that nice, deep, what we call 10-foot shine. So that's the basic principle of what we do. All we're really doing when we polish a piece of stone, and for that matter, it also, with anything you polish, a metal, VCT, anything that has a shine on it, this is the concept, it's the physics, if you will, of why this shines. So what we need to do is just smooth that rough surface. And how do we do that? Well, obviously, in our industry, we use diamond pads. So we use diamond abrasives, and you guys have all done this, I'm sure, when you're going through the following steps. In certain stones, you'll get a nice shine at say 800, and you just need that last pop. So you break out the polishing powder to give it that last pop, right? And many times you can go all the way up with diamonds, go up to, your 3,000, 5,000. God, they even go up way past that and see if that pops the shine on there. Okay, but we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail here, especially when it comes to my tips as to why some stones react that way. Not only why some stones react that way, but why some stones actually work here on the same particular type of stone and not here on the other particular part of the stone. So, let's take this wavy, unpolished stone surface. How do we create that nice, smooth surface? Well, we've already talked about one, and that is through abrasion, either through your diamonds or your polishing powders. But there are two other ways. And actually, there's three total, so let's break them down one at a time. There's obviously putting a wax or a coating or some type of a film on top of the surface. And basically what that does is just fills all those highs and lows in with a polymer to give you that nice smooth surface, although you tend to get somewhat of a plastic type finish on there. That's one way. The other way is crystallization, recrystallization, or vitrification, whatever you want to call it. And I've actually done a whole show on that. I have a YouTube video on that. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons, but basically what I'll talk about is what crystallization does. That process is it actually takes the rough calcium for marble. Now, when we're talking granite, it's a whole different story when it comes to crystallization. But the concept is still the same. We're smoothing the surface. What the crystallization does, it's more of a chemical reaction. It actually attacks the calcium, smooths it out, places another product in there called the fluorosilicate. In other words, initially, then what you get basically is a nice smooth surface. Okay. And of course, the other way is with polishing powders. Now, I may or may not have talked about this on the show. I can't remember, but there's basically two concepts to using polishing powders. You either have your marble polishing, limestone slash polishing powders, which contain an abrasive and oxalic acid, and your granite polishing powders that contain no oxalic acid, but they contain an abrasive. So the concept is the same. We're just trying to smooth it. However, when it comes to polishing calcium-based stones like marble and limestone, what you're basically what's happening is the oxalic acid is literally attacking the stone. In other words, you know what happens when you put a couple of drops of acid on marble, it etches it. Well, basically, that's what it's doing. It's microscopically etching it, but at the same time, you're basically taking that abrasive and smoothing it out. So, if you want to think of it as melting the stone, that's okay. It's really not what's happening, but basically what it's doing is it's softening the stone so the abrasive can move it, which is why when you use a polishing powder that has oxalic acid in it, you tend to pop that calcium-based stone much quicker. Now, when it comes to granite and achieving that surface, it's purely abrasive. There's no chemical reaction there. You just simply have an abrasive. You get finer and finer and finer with your diamonds. And you guys know that when you do granite, you're going to use different diamonds. You're going to use higher diamonds. We're not going to get into that here until I get to the tips, and I'll give you some suggestions and tips there for polishing some of those difficult marbles. So, what we basically have is three ways. We have coating it, we have crystallization, and we have powder polishing. That's how we achieve that nice, smooth surface. So, with that said, before we get into the tips, because I'm going to leave that to the very last to keep you guys hanging in there. And by the way, if you're listening and you want to call in, the telephone number is 323 870-3968. That's 323-870-3968. Or you can just send me an email if you're listening at fhouston at gmail. That's FHUESTON at gmail.com. Or if you're watching me right now on Facebook, just simply send me an instant message. Let me just check to make sure don't have any here, and I don't. And I'll just go ahead and send me a message there, and I'll answer your question there as well. So, why is it? Let's get into one of the main topics here. Why is it that you can polish one particular type of stone? Let's take an example. Let's say you're doing cream of marfil. Everyone seems to know what cream of marfil is, and you're going into someone's house. They got a kitchen and a dining area, and you hone it and you polish it. It comes out beautiful. I mean, it just looks gorgeous. You get paid. Everybody's happy. Well, your next door neighbor who happens to have the same cream of marfil calls you a week or so later, and they want their stone polished. And you go in there, you do the same exact thing, and guess what? You're not getting the polish. So what's the difference? It's the same material. It could be from the same quarry, but why is it reacting that way? So here are the things that I've come up with. Now, also, if you keep an eye out for the next Slippery Rock Gazette, actually the October edition of the Stone Detective, I've actually written an article on that whole subject. You'll see in that Stone Detective article, and I believe that's coming out in October. But uh, there's several things that why that occurs, why it reacts differently. The first being, and I've kind of hinted to it, is that you have to remember these are natural stones. So you can imagine taking blocks of stone out of the quarry, right? You take them out of the quarry, and it just so happens that even within a few feet of another block, you can have different minerals, and different minerals will react differently. You can have different densities. So the stone changes as you go through the quarry. It can be dense, it can be less dense, it can have more iron, less iron, a little bit more calcium, less calcium. So even though it's still cream of marfil in this case, it can react differently based on that thing alone. But there's some other reasons why you may be having trouble not polishing it in one area, but polishing it not. What am I trying to say? Polishing it in one area and not polishing in another area, and that could be how the stone is installed. And that's something you should always ask. If you're a restoration contractor, you should ask, how was a stone installed? Was it installed in a mud bed? Was it installed with thin set? What's it on? Is it on a concrete slab? Is it on a wood substructure? Try to find that out, because that could make all the difference in the world, depending on the type of setting material that was used. That setting material can have a lot of what we call soluble salts in it. And what can tend to happen is those soluble salts will rise to the surface, sometimes as efflorescence, but sometimes not. The salts actually deposit within the stone itself and causes the stone to react entirely differently, especially to some of your polishing powders. So that's the second reason. The third reason is what was done to the stone before. How is it being maintained? What type of sealers on it? That can have everything to do with it not reacting the same. Different sealers will have different polymers in it, and those can react funkily, if that's a word, um, depending on. So always ask, what do you use to clean a stone with? Was it polished before? Do you remember if it was sealed? Did you seal it? Did someone else seal it? Do you know what the sealer is? And the list goes on and on and on. Number four, the age of the installation can matter. Stone does age, even though, yeah, I know it's not a living thing. We all know that, but it can age, and it will age over time. So that can affect the way it polishes. Of course, older stone may have more wear to it, so the wear level is going to be an issue with it. So age is extremely important. And number five, less common, but I've seen this happen, is that the water that you're using to hone and polish may be different. In other words, you go to Mrs. Jones' house, and she's on a well, and it polishes fine. And you go to Mrs. Smith's house next door, she's also on a well, but she either has a water softener or she's treating her water unlike Mrs. Jones was. So you can get a different chemical reaction. And many times that can be the case. So I always ask, is this water treated? Is it city water? Is it well water? Always some good questions. So those are the reasons you can have stone polish, the same stone polish and hone actually too, differently in one area and not in an area. And that can happen in one job as well. And I've seen that happen on very large jobs like a bank lobby or a convention hall or something where you're going along just fine polishing and all of a sudden it's not polishing as well. It could be for those reasons that I mentioned. All right, one more time, I'll give the number out and we're going to get it into how to polish some of these difficult materials. The number here is 323-870-3968. All right, I've got a few tips for you. We're going to go over these tips based on the basic science that I gave you a few minutes ago, but also based on what we just talked about why it can treat different. But see, these are some of the tips, and I used to teach this a lot in my classes. And that is the first thing you may want to try is experiment with the amount of water that you're using with your polishing process. Let's say you're using 5X powder, which tends to be the most popular powder out there amongst others, but 5X is the old standard. And you try adding a little bit more water, try adding a little less water. And then you may want to use a technique that I call going from wet to dry. You start out with your powder, you start off with a little bit of water, and you take it totally dry and continue dry. And that happens to be a trick that works really well with granite and polishing granite, but it works exceptionally well with some difficult marbles, say Botticino being one. Some of your Verde marbles will also react really well to a wet to dry type polish. You may want to try a different powder. Now, here's where the chemistry comes into play because you can go out there and there are probably 100 to 200 different powders out there that you can buy. They're all basically the same thing except for the amount of oxalic acid that are in them when we're talking marble and limestone polish. So you could have what we call a hot powder, which simply means it has more oxalic acid. And I've seen some of these powders contain almost 99% oxalic acid and very little abrasive. Or you could have a cold powder, which has very little oxalic acid in it. So you need to become familiar with the powders. What I would suggest you do is choose 3 or 4 powders. Ask me off the air, ask some of the other restoration contractors what they use, and get used to those powders because you're going to find in some cases you're going to need a hot powder, and other cases you're going to need a powder that's not as hot. Now you can always boost a cold powder by adding more oxalic acid to it. So that's one way to do it. So actually that's tip number 3, add more oxalic acid. Uh, Number 4 tip would be, and I've mentioned this before, is try diamond polishing. Instead of stopping at a 400 and polishing, try going all the way up. And a lot of times with certain types of stone, doesn't work on all stones. In other words, it won't work on, say, Negro Marquina, some of your black marbles. Going up to your higher grits will give you the polish that you need without using any polishing powder whatsoever. Now, the last tip I have, I've got more than that, but this tip is something that I discovered a few years ago, and it works really well. And that is, you can achieve the final polish on most surfaces, including granite, okay, marble, limestone, granite, onyx, or whatever, using what we call a burnishing method. And what a burnishing method is simply high speed burnisher. In other words, you're talking, RPMs upwards of 3,000 RPM. Some of these are propane powered, some of them are electric power, but you have to use a special pad in order to achieve that. And depending on what pad you buy, the Norton pads, you have the Cheetah system, the Monkey pads, twisters, and they go on and on. Everybody seems to have them nowadays, but that very last what they call maintenance pad, you'd be surprised what they can do. I can remember doing an entire casino one time polishing granite, and we were getting some phenomenal polishing numbers as far as how much we were polishing in a night simply by burnishing. We were using big propane powered burnishers, put those maintenance pads under there, and it's done dry. And it's amazing. You can actually see as you're going down in a straight line how well they're being polished. So those are my tips. Now, I do have an article that I published called How to Polish Difficult Marbles, although the concepts here will apply to granite as well. If you want a copy of that, just send me an email to fhouston, FHUESTON at gmail.com. I believe I've also published that on my blog as well. So if you don't subscribe to that blog, again, send me an email Fhouston, Fhueston at gmail.com, and we'll get you subscribed to that blog or send me your email address and we'll get you on our email list as well so you can keep up to date with a lot of the articles that I do. And I'm constantly writing. So some really good information and some of these things here as well. Okay, before I close, I do want to mention actually before we close, let's take a quick break and I'll come back with some other announcements right after this. Alrighty, folks, we're back. If you're watching me on Facebook, you probably didn't hear that, and if obviously if you're listening on the podcast or the live radio, you could actually hear that. So I'm trying to work that out. So when you're watching me on Facebook, you can actually hear that as well. But anyway, I did want to mention again, and I know I've mentioned this a million times before. I do have the live class coming up in Las Vegas, and as far as I'm concerned, right now it is a go. I'm limiting to probably 8 to 10 people. So if you want to get signed up for that class, it's the troubleshooting and inspection class. Please send me an email. You can give me a small deposit now if you want to hold your spot. And again, just F Houston, Fhueston at gmail.com. So, folks, I guess that's going to wrap things up for today. Hopefully, I've given you some great information. And next week, we'll see. If you know anybody that wants to be on the show, simply have them send me an email. We'll get them interviewed on the phone. So, thanks for listening. Until next time, keep setting those tiles, polishing that stone, and fabricating those tops. Later, my friends. All right, all right, we have ended the live broadcast on the radio portion of it and a podcast portion of it, but I'm still live on Facebook here. So if anybody wants to comment any further, I'll hang around for another few minutes. And again, I don't know if you can, a lot of people have been asking me uh, this aquarium that's in the background here. What kind of fish do I have in it? It's a marine tank. In other words, a saltwater tank, and I've got some what we call blue chromis, which are some bluish greenish damsels in there. I have a puffer, and recently I had a nice snowy moray eel, and he died a couple days ago. So I'm looking to replace that as well. All right, folks. Well, I'm going to end the Facebook chat as well here. And again, if anybody wants that article on how to polish difficult marbles, simply send me an email and I'll get it right out to you. See you all next week.